Welcome back to another Before You Read lecture. This is the second of two lectures on the post-exilic prophets. As a reminder, in the first lecture, we discussed the idea of the minor prophets, or the Book of the 12, and talked generally about the post-exilic prophets and what we mean by that and their placement within the Book of the 12. And we discussed Haggai and Zechariah 1 through 8 and the focus on the rebuilding of the temple. The focus of this lecture is on material that's much earlier, perhaps a bit later. They have different concerns in these writings than the temple. We're going to focus on Zechariah 9 through 14 and on the book of Joel. So just again, two writings not so demanding. And there is a more pronounced focus on eschatology, something I discussed in an earlier lecture, and on the so-called Day of the Lord, the Great Day of the Lord. There's also an increased speculation on the future Messiah, the future king, perhaps in the line of David, who will rule the people of Israel. To begin with, I want to talk briefly about the book of Joel. The first thing to note about the book of Joel is that there's actually some different placement of Joel in the Hebrew Bible as opposed to the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible known as the Septuagint. In the Hebrew Bible, Joel occurs second in the collection of the minor prophets, right? And then in the Septuagint, he appears fourth in the minor prophets. Why is this? Well, it might be a chronological reason that the Hebrew Bible wants to move Joel up, or it might be more thematic. Joel demonstrates some important connections and themes sharing with the book of Amos. And so maybe the Hebrew Bible has arranged this in this way so that Amos and Joel sort of talk to one another. There are two major parts to the book of Joel. First, there is a description of God's judgment against Judah and Judah's response in 1 through chapter 2:17. And then the second part is about the restoration and the judgment of foreign nations, which we see in 2:18 through 3:21. As you read Joel, you'll want to be on the lookout for the day of the Lord. Again, this idea that was originally a festival day has been turned into a day of judgment for Judah and even for the world. Pay attention as well to Joel's use of earlier traditions. Where does Joel sound like something else you've read or something else you've seen? And pay attention to the nature of judgment and restoration. Next, I want to say something briefly about Zechariah 9 through 14 and Malachi. Just a little bit of Malachi because it's such a short book, and actually critical Old Testament scholarship suggests that maybe we read these together. John Collins, in his introduction to the Old Testament, says that this portion of Zechariah and all of Malachi are anonymous oracles that have been sort of added to the minor prophets. Zechariah 9 through 14, also known as Second Zechariah, contains some of the most difficult and obscure writing in all of the Hebrew Bible. There are some themes that are apparent, however. One is the theme of judgment and restoration, similar to what we saw in Joel. There's also more speculation about the coming ruler, and the idea of shepherds is another theme in Zechariah. Malachi is really named after verse 3:1, chapter 3, verse 1, which mentions my messenger. Malachi in Hebrew is simply that, my messenger. And so this is perhaps where we get the name of the book, Malachi. Malachi consists of 6 speeches and a couple of appendices at the end. At least that's how John Collins reads it. So, that might be helpful as you engage it. And once again, major themes of Malachi include a critique of the priesthood and a discussion of worship, not unlike what we might have seen in 3rd Isaiah. There's a clearer universal horizon, a clearer interest in all of the nations of the earth. And there's a fascinating discussion of marriage and divorce, especially when we think about what we read in Ezra and Nehemiah. As you read, I invite you to consider three questions as you engage Joel, Zechariah 9 through 14, and Malachi. The first is, how do these writings imagine the restoration of God's people? And what does that restoration entail? Second, how do these writings point to or gesture to the end of days or the great day of the Lord? And what does that signify for them? And finally, what do we learn about expectations for the future ruler of God's people? What do we learn about these Messiah figures who are promised or expected or anticipated to rule the people of Israel? Once again, a shorter reading assignment, a little bit more manageable, but I'm sure there'll be lots of questions about obscurities or about curiosities, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Now get to it.